Building a Better World. One can examine the immediate post-war period, roughly from 1945 to 1948, through two variant lenses. On one hand, the Grand Alliance was unable to resolve upon a grand post-war settlement at Potsdam. This would ultimately provoke the Cold War between Stalin and the West. On the other hand, there was enough common ground between the wartime allies that they honored the substance of their wartime agreements and cooperated to erect the edifice of a new international system to prevent another World War II catastrophe. The result of this tense collaboration was a network of international institutions designed to punish Axis warmongers, to renounce the dehumanizing principles of fascism, to create a more stable infrastructure for the global economy, and to forge a durable peace. Together, the Nuremberg Tribunals, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Bretton Woods system established the foundation for a new international system to replace the discredited Versailles structure that had collapsed in the ravages of the Great Depression and the devastation of World War. It is a depressing truth, but rarely do ordinary people, great souls, or noble ideals write the pages of history. In the dark aftermath of World War II, however, popular disillusionment proved so profound that it put pressure on international statesmen, national leaders, and policymakers to reform the international system, as well as the world economy and state institutions, to ensure that survivors would never be ravaged again by the scourge of war. The foundation for the post-war economy was laid in an obscure town in New Hampshire. At Bretton Woods, delegates from 44 states assembled to discuss post-war reconstruction. They arrived with war still raging across the planet, but with Allied victory now seeming assured. Bretton Woods was an economic conference, but the delegates believed that World War II was an outcome and symptom of the collapse of the international economy during the 1930s. The delegates believed that the Great Depression had fueled extremist doctrines and xenophobic nationalism. These both contributed to the rise of Hitler and other fascist regimes across the world. During the crisis of the 1930s, international trade had collapsed in the wake of a rising tide of nationalist sentiment, predatory tariffs, and selfish currency devaluations. So it was very clear to assembled delegates that rebuilding Europe, putting the pieces of the international economy back together, would prove a daunting challenge. Given how Europe had served center stage for this devastating total war. Out of the Bretton Woods Conference came the so-called Bretton Woods system. What delegates agreed to was to iron out the outlines of a post-war economic system that could restore faith in free markets and create a structure that would increase confidence in international collaboration while also creating mechanisms to spur post-war economic recovery. By far, the most significant agreement reached at Bretton Woods concerned the creation of the international monetary system. To jumpstart international trade, it would be necessary to ensure greater currency stability. The key to achieving this was an international governed system of fixed exchange rates. This would prevent predatory currency devaluations that had haunted the Great Depression. The Bretton Woods delegates ultimately agreed to peg their national currencies both to gold and the US dollar. Before World War II, it would have been unimaginable that states would conscience such an infringement upon their national sovereignty. But in the wake of the Depression and World War, delegates appreciated the benefits of international collaboration and its necessity for facilitating bilateral trade and averting a post-war recession. To ensure that national currencies remained fixed, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was created to police member states and help them to manage periodic fluctuations in their currency. Another institution to emerge out of Bretton Woods, largely as an afterthought, was the International Bank for Economic Recovery and Development, now usually referred to more simply as the World Bank. The mandate of this institution was to provide capital for repairing shuttered factories and devastated infrastructure to facilitate post-war economic recovery. Although this institution was created primarily with an eye towards Europe, it would later assume importance as an international agency to finance economic development in the Third World. At Bretton Woods, delegates had also agreed upon an international trade organization to facilitate the lowering of tariffs and other trade barriers. But ultimately, the United States refused to participate, citing it as an infringement on their national sovereignty. In its place, in 1947, international delegates at Havana agreed to establish the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT. The basic idea was that this would provide a forum for lowering tariffs on a wide range of commodities to promote economic efficiency after the war. Ultimately, GATT evolved into the World Trade Organization. From 1948 to 1986, GATT met on various occasions and agreed to 6 major measures lowering tariffs. This had the effects of progressively increasing trade among the Western states. During the Uruguay round of GATT in 1986, previous agreements were rolled into a newly established World Trade Organization that today oversees the global economy and promotes free trade principles. Another pillar of the post-war order was the creation of a network of institutions to prevent genocide, racial persecution, and to protect ordinary people from the scourge of war. At Nuremberg, formerly the spiritual capital of Nazi Germany, Hitler's adjutants were hauled before an international tribunal and held accountable for the devastation of World War II. The Western public watched in fascination as the Nazis shuffled to the microphone and incredulously declared themselves nicht schuldig, or not guilty. Given the devastation and the images from Buchenwald, this argument seemed fantastic and served as further vindication of Nazi barbarism. After lengthy deliberations, Allied jurists held the Nazis accountable for two main crimes: provoking war and what they called crimes against humanity. The latter was an obvious reference to the Holocaust and various other atrocities. But the German lawyers vigorously disputed these charges. In vain, they argued that the tribunal had no jurisdiction and represented victors' justice. What is more, their clients had not violated any domestic law or international treaty. Accordingly, the Nazi lawyers argued, their defendants were being unjustly indicted for laws and international standards that the court was establishing ex post facto, after the fact. The legal argument was technically sound, but it was also tone deaf in light of the terrible suffering these men had unleashed on the world. The Nuremberg Tribunal was important, not only in bringing top Nazis to justice and giving people in the West at least a sense of catharsis, but also in establishing the so-called Nuremberg Laws, a new type of jurisprudence that we would today call international law. In other words, the Allied judges created a legal structure to fit the crimes of the Nazis and to make sure that in the future, national leaders that precipitated or participated in civilian murder and defied international law would be held to account. Another important expression of this post-war sentiment for reform and justice was a deliberation concerning a new Charter of Rights that would protect ordinary people from mayhem and the ravages of war. After much debate, the United Nations agreed to promulgate an Universal Declaration of Human Rights that assigned individuals inalienable rights regardless of their gender, race, religion, or state of citizenship. Invoking the French Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, the United Nations declared that ordinary people could not be enslaved, tortured, or subjected to abuse that was cruel or unnatural. This declaration passed with much fanfare, although the Soviet bloc and its police states abstained. Eleanor Roosevelt viewed the Universal Declaration of Rights as an international Magna Carta that would inspire post-war states to enshrine these principles into domestic laws and constitutions. Some Arab jurists, however, argued that the rights specified in the document were Eurocentric and did not reflect the aspirations of Muslims and other non-Western cultural groups. Many later critics would argue that as a mere declaration, rather than a formal treaty, the endorsement of human rights had no legal force and would routinely be violated during the Cold War. Finally, at Geneva, the Third and Fourth Convention were negotiated and passed in 1949. Building on earlier precedents, these agreements outlawed many of the atrocities that occurred during World War II and outlined the principles of just warfare, specifically rules for treating prisoners of war and protecting civilians in war zones. Never again was the mantra of the immediate post-war era. The sentiment was shared by victors and losers alike, both in the East and the West. This sense of catastrophe represented the common ground that facilitated the creation of a new international organization to govern the post-war world and to manifest the ideal of peace and prosperity. The United Nations did not emerge in a vacuum. During the war, U.S. President Roosevelt was the most ardent supporter for the creation of a post-war international body. His vision was that of the four policemen: the great powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China, would serve as a watchdog and use their predominance of power to collectively squash a menace like Hitler before they grew into a global menace. This notion of security well reflected the disillusionment with appeasement during the 1930s, in which the League of Nations failed to contain fascist aggression. Churchill and Stalin were less enthusiastic about creating such an international body, but they did acknowledge that the now discredited League of Nations had functioned well in certain respects, and that its reformulation might be useful in creating an institution that could keep the post-war peace and protect future generations from the scourge of war. Suspicious of the idealistic values of his Western partners, Stalin wanted to make sure that the United Nations would not be turned against him. To balance out the overrepresentation of Western European states, he proposed assigning every Soviet republic a delegate. This demand was rejected by the West, but Truman did agree to Stalin's demand that the great powers be given a veto to prevent the institution from being turned against their interests. Any reader of the preamble of the United Nations Charter will hear the echo of the Atlantic Charter. The UN most clearly manifests the Atlantic dream for post-war reform. To ensure post-war peace and prosperity, delegates at San Francisco in 1945 instituted a General Assembly. This body incorporated all the nation states as members and was to serve as a forum where states could resolve their differences diplomatically. Additionally, the UN was outfitted with a Security Council that, unlike its predecessor, the League of Nations, will be given the teeth necessary to intervene and protect collective security. Ideas concerning a permanent standing army were rejected. Instead, member nations would be asked to contribute forces when the Security Council had need upon them. While the UN best exemplifies post-war idealism, it almost immediately failed to live up to its designed function. The mechanisms of the United Nations were predicated on the assumption of great power collaboration, and that the great powers would espouse or repress their national interest and act in ways that benefited the international community as a whole. Neither ideal proved to be in touch with reality. They were hopelessly idealistic. This became clear during the Berlin crisis. Far from cooperating, the United States and Soviet Union became locked in a global struggle. Accordingly, the United Nations, instead of serving as an instrument for global peace, was transformed into a forum for Cold War bickering. The original United Nations was dominated by a core of Western liberal democracies, as well as industrialized states. By the 1960s, however, the United Nations had considerably expanded. Most non-Western peoples had won their independence from colonialism. And as these former colonies became members of the United Nations, they acquired a majority in the General Assembly. Increasingly, they transformed this body into a forum for airing their grievances with the West. With the UN no longer functioning as intended, the Western states increasingly looked to a more narrow international set of organizations to achieve their collective business. NATO emerged to ensure the security of Western Europe, while the OECD emerged as a forum for economic collaboration. By the 1960s, the UN struggled to develop a mandate of its own. The Atlantic Charter had initiated not only a crusade against fascism, but sowed the seeds for a blueprint for post-war reform. During World War II, the Atlantic Dream became increasingly concrete as statesmen sought to plan for post-war reconstruction and economic recovery. From 1945 to 1948, the Atlantic Dream came to be inscribed in a network of international institutions that together established a new post-war system. This edifice fell far short of the ambitions of its makers, but it did nonetheless create an infrastructure that helped to ensure that the post-war era was more stable and peaceful than it had been during the first half of the 20th century.